Great. Well, welcome to Denver and the Anschutz Health and Wellness Center. It's an opportunity for me to give you some of my biases. I'm kind of going to really cover the waterfront here. I feel like my task is to sort of set the stage for some of the presentations that are coming up. You're going to hear from other folks in more depth about a number of things, how the brain regulates body weight, physical activity, aspects of diet, sedentariness, things like that. But what I wanted to do is to kind of give you an overall framework about how the body regulates weight, or at least my bias is about that in the time that we have here. Let's start with just a couple of people. Welcome to my clinic. Here's one guy, AJ. At age 20, he was 5'6" and weighed 145 pounds. At age 60, he weighs 205 pounds, which gives him a body mass index of 33, which is in the obese category. He has some diabetes, hypertension, and degenerative arthritis. This is a typical patient that I might see in my clinic. So over his lifetime, he gradually gained weight and now has some health problems related to his weight. His friend, GB, when he was 20 years old, was the same, 5'6" and 145 pounds. But now at age 60, he only weighs 150 pounds, so he's different. Somebody asked, why don't we all gain weight? And we'll talk a little bit about that in this time frame. And his health is currently good. So what's the difference between these two people? How does this regulatory system seem to work pretty well in this guy and doesn't seem to work so well in this guy? So AJ works at a desk. He eats out frequently. He gets no regular exercise, and he only gets 5 to 6 hours of sleep per night. Whereas his high school friend still works a construction job at age 60. His wife cooks healthy, and he hikes and skis on weekends. So they have different lifestyle habits. So is that why their weight is different? So if you think about the math here, AJ had a change in fat mass over 40 years of 60 pounds. It's not just fat mass. He has more lean body mass. He has more bone mass. Other organs are bigger. But he physically, we're physically made out of the stuff we eat. Isn't that wild? You put the food in your mouth, it turns into your body. So over this 40 years, he got 60 pounds more body than his friend did. If you just do the math, this represents about 160,000 calories of tissue. So that's the kind of the positive energy balance that he had over that time period. But actually, if you do the math, there are formulas for how much energy you expend. We'll spend more time talking about energy expenditure. And the formulas relate to your age, your sex, your size, and your age is in there. So as we get older, our energy expenditure goes down. And so if we think about his energy expenditure at age 20 and you do the math and you use an activity factor that shows him to be moderately active, he was eating about 2,500 calories a day at age 20. At age 60, despite the fact that he's heavier, he's less physically active, he actually has to eat less. Even though he's bigger, he's eating less food at age 60. Isn't that wild? So that's the future for all of us, is unless we gradually eat less or get more physically active in our life, we're going to gain weight. That's just kind of that's the fact of aging and the fact that your metabolic rate declines as you age. In contrast, GB had a change in fat mass over 40 years of 5 pounds. Now, he did gain some weight, but if you do the math, it's only 22,000 calories over 40 years. We'll show you what he ate in a second. But because he really didn't gain weight, if you do the math, he actually is eating substantially less. He's eating about 400 calories less at age 60 than he was at age 20. So not only does the body regulate ins and outs, but it has to account for the fact that our metabolic rate declines with aging. So that's a little discouraging, that you gradually have to eat less and less and less, or exercise more and more as you get older, or you're going to gain weight. Those are sort of the choices. Well, how much did they eat? Let's just do the math. 40 years, 365 days, estimated 2,300 kilocalories per day. 33 million calories over that time, or 15,000 pounds of food. So the fact that one guy only gains 5 pounds over a time frame when he ate 15,000 pounds of food, there's some kind of regulation going on here. Even for the person who gains weight, there's really a dramatic biologic system that goes on here. And that's what we're going to talk about. I'm just repeating those numbers here. So how does this happen, really? That's the deal, is how much you eat, that's your energy intake. All those little decisions that you made. When you got up this morning, did you eat breakfast? What did you eat? How did you decide what to eat? That was your brain deciding what kind of fuel you've been burning and what you need. And it has to be balanced to what your energy expenditure is, such that over long periods of time there's a remarkable balance between these two. And the boss that's doing it is your brain, but it's measuring things that are happening outside in your body somewhere. So to kind of make this case, this is an old study that was done in rats. This is a rat. There's the rat's weight over the rat's lifetime here in days. That's kind of a long time in a rat's life. And what you can see is a rat left in a cage will gradually gain weight over its whole life. But if you either overfeed the rat or underfeed it, so you take a rat here and you put a tube in its stomach, give it more food than it wants to eat, and so it will gain weight. But as soon as you take that tube out of its stomach and stop feeding it, its weight goes back not to where it was, but to where it would have been. Isn't that wild? I mean, what I'm trying to show here is what does this regulatory system look like in a pure biologic setting where we don't have televisions and stuff like that. This is a rat. If a rat loses weight, you can stop feeding the rat file or feed it less. It'll lose some weight, but as soon as you stop the diet, the rat's weight goes back not to where it was, but to where it would have been. So that's the natural history of weight in a rat, progressive weight gain over its whole life, and the body regulates around this trajectory. Not a homeostatic constant weight, but a trajectory of weight over the course of the rat's lifespan. And some rats, you can breed rats so that some of them are obesity prone and others obesity resistant. So they have a trajectory, a biologic trajectory probably determined by genetics, that is prone to more weight gain over the course of the life or less weight gain over life. And this is probably true of humans as well. We did some studies a number of years ago where we asked people, are you a naturally thin person? And people come out of the woodwork, they say, oh, so-and-so, he's one of those people. He can't gain weight. I sit down with him at the bar and he eats just like I do. He can't gain weight is what people say. Or other people know that they struggle with weight gain over time. So there's some genetics involved here, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Well, does this rat study have anything to do with humans? And again, welcome to my clinic. I asked Mrs. Jones, so tell me about your weight. Just draw a picture of your weight over your life. And she says, well, I went to college and I gained weight, and then I got married and I lost some weight and I kept it off for a while. And then I got pregnant and I gained a bunch of weight and I got some of it off, but I couldn't get most of it off, so I went to Weight Watchers. And then I got this very stressful job. Does this sound like anybody you know? I took some medications and lost weight. So does the rat look like the human, or does the human look like the rat? Again, when I see people like this, they say that Weight Watchers, it doesn't work because I regained not only what I had lost, but then some. But what I actually show this picture to my patients because I say something like, what do you think your weight would have been had you not done that? So I think people are intuitively aware of this trajectory over their life, that really for most of us there's progressive weight gain. Actually, I remember I asked a guy a few months ago, I said, so what would you weigh if you weren't doing what you're doing? He says, this isn't working. My diet's just not working. I'm trying to lose weight. I'm eating salad and I'm gaining weight. It just makes no sense to me. And I say, what would your weight be if you weren't doing what you're doing? And he kind of looks at me incredulously and says, sky's the limit. So he's aware of this. He's aware that the underlying biology of his body really wants to weigh even more than what he weighs now. So if we think about our two guys, what happens is they're born, we're all born happy and healthy, right? And it's downhill from there. So we have some kind of genetics, and we're of normal weight at some point in our life, and we live in some kind of an environment, and time goes by. And we adopt habits, diet and physical activity habits, because at the end of the day, it's energy in, energy out. But where did we learn to do that? Where did we figure out how to eat? And where did we decide that we're going to be physically active like Jim Hill or not like me? And then we do that for years and years and years, day after day after day. And some of us gain weight, and some of us become frankly obese. And this phenotype, this weight, is a reflection of those diet and physical activity habits. And what we worry about is this. Why do we care about weight? It's because it causes health problems. It causes problems in our lives. But really, once we get to this point, there's many, many years of biology that's gone on before we get there. So how does this biology work? I'm going to start where I did on the figure with genetics, because I think genetics plays a role, and I'm going to tell, this is a very old story. I haven't shared this story in a long time, but some of you, we say leptin, and it used to be that everybody would want to know what is leptin, and you all know what leptin is now, but I think we forget about the story. So Well, I'll tell you that. Good. She said, what is leptin? And I was, leptin. Yeah, you've heard the name, but I go back to the story because I think the story tells us how long it takes science to develop and how one observation plays out over time. So back in the 60s, there were these two mouse strains that were developed at the Jackson Labs. So the Jackson Labs just would breed rats, and some of them would get fat, some of them wouldn't, and they would do fancy genetic, or just old-fashioned genetics, really. And so
where's the Jackson Lab?
It's in Maine? Maine, yeah. And so they had these two strains of rats, the DB mouse and the OB mouse. And here's a picture of a DB mouse and its sibling. And these are really, really heavy rats. And the OB mouse is too. And they thought there was a single gene involved here. And there was this idea that how does your brain know what you ate? I mean, the brain has to do this calculation every day. It's got to decide how much am I eating because of how much am I burning, and it has to balance those. How does the brain know what to do? It's got to measure something. So there was an old idea from the 50s that George Kennedy had that maybe fat tissue is talking to the brain and telling it how big it is, and that's how the brain knows. So he hypothesized a humoral factor that came from adipose tissue. And so this Douglas Coleman guy at the Jackson Labs did this wild experiment. In 1965, he did these experiments. So he took one of those OB mice and basically opened it up here and sewed it to another rat, called a parabiosis experiment. So I don't even know if you can do these things anymore. But the idea was...
blood.
What's that?
Wasn't that just that study where they had like the young blood and the old blood?
Yeah, it's parabiosis in humans maybe. So, but the idea was if there's a humoral factor, as Kennedy had hypothesized, it would go across this thing, and then we could see what was happening here. And so what he found is that if you took this OB, I don't know if you can see my pointer here, if you take this OB mouse here and sew it to its lean partner, it loses weight. So the idea is, well, this normal mouse must be making something that this one's lacking, because when you sew them together, it fixes this one. So that kind of hypothesized, provided evidence that what was happening in this OB mouse was it was lacking this humoral factor. Whereas if you take this DB mouse and sew it to a normal mouse, the normal mouse loses weight, suggesting that this one's making the factor, but it can't respond to it can't respond to it normally, and this one responds to that factor normally, and so it loses weight. If you take an OB mouse and sew it to a DB mouse, then the OB mouse loses weight and the DB doesn't, supporting this idea that this one's lacking the factor and this one can't respond to it. So that was the old-fashioned experiment, 1965, and what happened was fancy molecular biology came along and they found what the gene was. Because how do you find this? It's genetic, so you look at the sequence of the genes and you say, where's the problem? And they found the problem in this one where the thing's broken, and they said, that's where it is, and they said, what is it? And they found that it was this thing called leptin. And from this, I won't bore you with all the science, but what we learned was that fat cells make this hormone, leptin, and that leptin goes to the brain. And a huge number of studies, here's the hypothalamus. That's your whole brain, and there's that hypothalamus. And there's a very small place. There's your pituitary gland, so that's the hypothalamus. And there's this arcuate nucleus there. And what a bunch of studies have shown is that there's two populations of cells here, brakes and gas. So that's how the hypothalamus does it. Eat more and store, or burn more and be full. So it's kind of brakes and gas. And so that's how the brain tends to work. It doesn't have one speed. You know, if you had a car and all you had was gas, it would be hard to drive. But if you have brakes and gas, now you can really hone in on things. So there's the brakes and gas system here. So leptin, the hormone, binds to a receptor. So that's the receptor that senses this, because that's where the DB problem is. They don't have a receptor that doesn't work. The OB mice, they didn't make the hormone. So that explains those parabiotic experiments. So it acts on these neurons with things like alpha MSH. This cell makes another neurotransmitter, which then acts downstream on this melanocortin receptor, which then lowers food intake. Because what happened with the OB mouse, it doesn't make the hormone, so it doesn't stimulate MSH, and it doesn't reduce food intake. So it's unrestrained food intake. So this was, everybody said, oh, this is the cure to obesity here, right? Is leptin here. It turned out to not be. But there are people who have leptin deficiency. This is a boy, age 7, weighs over 100 pounds, and he's leptin deficient. One of about 5 or 6 people in the world that has leptin deficiency, or maybe there's 10 now. So this is incredibly rare, but this is sort of the human version of the OB mouse. And if you give him the hormone, if you give him leptin, by the time he's 13, he weighs about 78 pounds. So he actually weighs less here at age 13 and he's taller than he was at age 7. So what did the genetics do? Genetics points to proteins or molecules that are just part of this regulatory system. The system is regulated, it's super complicated, there are a lot of moving parts. But I think through the genetics, what we have done is we found parts of the system and sort of built our understanding of how the system works. So what do we learn from genetics? I think there are again, some of you know about genetic studies, some of you don't. One way we can do genetics is the so-called candidate genes. So that is, you take a protein where you think this maybe has something to do with it, like diabetes has something to do with insulin or insulin receptors. So then you look at the genetics of that protein because it would make sense. So the candidate genes, people have looked at leptin, they've looked at the melanocortin receptor, they've looked at leptin receptors. So that's using your understanding of the biology and looking at specific genes that you think are related. But the modern way of doing this is another approach called whole genome scans. So that means you don't have an idea of what it is, you just look at the whole DNA and say, where is the DNA different in somebody who's heavy versus somebody who's not? And then you figure out what it does later. So this has no hypothesis. So this is the kind of genetic studies that can be done. Old-fashioned candidate genes or whole genome studies. And I'll show you some of these. But the bottom line of these whole genome scans is it looks like there are many genes with small effects and that these genes actually interact with the environment. And I'll show you what that is. Jim Hill, I think, is fond of saying our genetics have not changed in the last 50 years. And that's true, but that doesn't mean that genetics don't play an important role. It means that genes that have been there are now interacting with an environment in some way that promotes weight gain. And I'll show you one of the most common gene that we have that promotes obesity is called this FTO gene, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. So what do we do with this? You know, are we ready for getting your whole genome done and then you have a gene for obesity? I don't think we're there yet. I don't think it's super useful information. It may be in the future that genetics can sort of say, you're the kind of person that if you drink soda and you're not physically active, you're going to gain weight. So it's most important for you to be physically active and change your diet in this way. Maybe that's where we'll go. But I think in some ways, I think what's happened is we focus so much on the environment that we forget the biology. So I want to be a little voice here for, I think the biology is really important, not because its standalone determines what you're going to be, but because different people have different predispositions. I think it was the question somebody asked about why do some people gain weight, some don't. Because some people have genetic predisposition to weight gain in the same environment. Other people have a genetic predisposition for weight regulation because their regulatory system just works super well. So here's a study that looks at these things. Here's leptin receptor deficient humans, leptin deficient humans, melanocortin deficient humans. So what they did is they took a bunch of kids and they said the heaviest kids we can find. And they said maybe they have genes for these things. And you look at the numbers, 10 kids here, 5 kids here, 5 kids. These are incredibly rare. And that's their BMI standard deviation score. That means these kids are 5 to 8 standard deviations. These are super heavy kids. Here's their percent body fat, 50 to 60% body fat in kids. So the candidate genes, the specific molecules in the hypothalamus, yes, there are some people who have defects in those, but they're very rare and they tend to present as very serious obesity in young kids. Whereas the garden variety genes have small effects and probably all of us have 1 or 2 or 5 or 6 of those. So here's a genome-wide GWAS, they call this, genome-wide association study. So with the advent of sequencing machines that can look at your whole DNA, then what they do is they just look at all of your DNA, lay it out in a line for 15 miles or whatever it is, and just compare somebody who's thin, bunch of people who are thin with people who aren't, and then you say, where do they differ? And so things look the same. This is kind of, they're along this position in their DNA. Everything's the same except right here, it looks like people pile up. These are people, and I won't go into what that is. This has to do with body mass index. So if these people really vary in body mass index and their genes are very different right here compared to the people who don't have that weight. Here's one for type 2 diabetes. And in this very same position on the genome, something is important. That's all you get from this. You don't know what it is. So now they have to go in and look at that and say, what is this thing? And it turns out this thing is this FTO gene. What is that? That is a fused toe mutant in a mouse or something. Nobody even knows what it is. So what we learned from this was this is a very common gene that predisposes to obesity in humans. It may be that even 20 or 30% of us have one of the alleles that predisposes to weight gain. But it's some protein that it's still not entirely clear what the protein does or where it lives or why it should do this. So you see how the genetics are kind of complicated? You can use something that makes biologic sense or something that's completely novel that we'll have to learn what to do with this kind of information. Well, here's some data that I think shows how this works. What they did here is they took people with 10 high-risk alleles. So what did I tell you? I said the genes, there's a lot of them, but they have small effects. So they took people and they selected out people from a large cohort study who had 10 of these genes that put them at risk for weight gain. And then they looked at what they ate because they had diet intake data as well. And what you can see is the people, here are people who drank sugar-sweetened beverages or artificially sweetened beverages. And they did that. They had Coke less than once a month or more than one time per day. And so if you had these genes, what happened is you tended to have 2 BMI points greater than those who did not have that gene. So if, on the other hand, you were drinking artificially sweetened beverage, you had a very modest effect, a modest increase in weight. So the gene itself did not have that big effect. But if you had the gene and you had a diet that was of poor quality, then you had a BMI that was 2 points greater. So again, my purpose here is not to say you need to know this gene or this specific data, but to give the theme of where the genetics is going. That the genetics are important, but they interact with specific environmental factors. That's where the genetic studies are going. Well, how does this system work? How do we maintain energy homeostasis? I kind of said it's energy in and energy out. But you didn't eat energy this morning, right? You ate food, and the food has fat, glucose, and protein. And so not only does the brain have to measure calories, it's got to measure something about how much of these nutrients are you eating and how much are you burning and where's the storage. So it's even the task of the brain is even more complicated than measuring energy. And in fact, it's super complicated because I draw it like it's a balance, like I'm in energy balance now. But none of us are really ever in energy balance. If this is some kind of, energy balance place, then in the morning, what happens is you eat breakfast and you wake up and you're sort of in negative energy balance. And then you eat breakfast and so now you're more positive and now you're sitting around not eating, so you're burning energy and so you're becoming more negative. And then you'll eat lunch and you'll be more positive. Maybe you exercise and all of a sudden you're in negative energy balance. And then at dinner, you're probably as full as you're going to be all day, and overnight, you burn fuel. So you're not in steady state. You're constantly changing. And actually, if you think about tissues in your body, when I first eat breakfast, my intestine is in very positive energy balance, but my muscles haven't seen any of that food yet. They're still in negative energy balance. And so at any moment in time, not only am I in different states of energy balance, but different tissues at the same time are in different. I don't know how the brain does this anyway. I mean, think back to those numbers. What did I say, like 13,000 pounds of food? And the guy only gains 5 pounds? I mean, that's an error of like 0.001%. So the system works unbelievably well. And yet, how does this thing even do this? Somebody said, why don't we all get fat? I think the answer is, I don't know. I'm amazed this thing works at all. So I think the core pieces, though, are energy, energy out. And so how much do I get to eat every day? It's equal to how much energy I burn. So how much energy do I burn? Well, the energy that I burn is equal to basal metabolic rate. This is the energy cost of just being alive. So if I'm just laying here, then my heart's pumping, I'm breathing, my electrolytes are going where they need to be, my brain is sort of on idle or something like that, and that's basal metabolic rate. If I eat food, there's a certain amount of energy it takes to digest the food, to break it down, to move it around my body. That's called the thermic effect of food. And then there's physical activity. And I draw this because it's the most variable component. If you are Michael Phelps, then your physical activity and your training for the Olympics, then this might be 3,000 calories a day. If you're me, this is like, I don't know, 50 calories or something. So who cares? The total energy expenditure, if you add this up, basal metabolic rate, thermic effect of food, and physical activity, that's total energy expenditure, and that equals how much I get to eat today. So that, because if I eat more than that, then I gain weight. If I eat less than that, I lose weight. So that's the basic pieces of this, of the energy balance equation on the expenditure side. Well, what's the relationship between weight and energy expenditure? I see patients all the time, and they say, well, I'm not eating anything, and I'm gaining weight. And you have a metabolic problem, and Dan, you need to fix this. Well, here's the data. Here's 24-hour energy expenditure as it relates to fat-free mass or size. So the bigger you are, the higher your energy expenditure. So it's aligned. The more you weigh, the more energy you burn. And that makes sense. If you're bigger, there's more tissue to feed every day. Your heart has to pump more. So the reality is somebody who's big has got to be eating 3,000 calories a day. There's some variation. There are some people who weigh 80 kilograms and they burn more than other people, but it's in this range. There's nobody up here who's burning 1,000 calories a day. Zero. Nobody's doing that. So energy expenditure relates to your physical size, especially lean body mass. I'm going back to genetics here. I know this is a little bit of a digression, but I wanted to show you the energy expenditure piece so that when you see these figures, they'll make sense to you. So I'm going back to genetics just for a second here, because it gives this example of how genetics and environment interact and how it relates to this energy balance equation. So these are Pima people living in Arizona. So who are the Pima people? The Pima people walked from Russia, across the Bering Land Bridge to Alaska, and then they walked to Mexico City, and then they walked to Phoenix. And so who lived through that migration? That's unbelievable, right? Human migration. Well, the people outside of Phoenix are on a reservation, and this is what they look like. 90% of them are obese, and 50% have diabetes. So they've been heavily studied because people thought they would teach us something about the genetics and biology of type 2 diabetes. But some years ago, they found a group of genetically related Pima people living in northern Mexico, an agrarian lifestyle in northern Mexico. Now, any of you who've been to northern Mexico, how'd you like to grow stuff in northern Mexico? It's desolate. And so when they found those people, this is what they look like. So they're genetically similar to these folks, but they're living in a different environment. So the genetics were clearly important, but how does the environment affect it? So what do you think the problem is? Do you think the people in Phoenix are eating more, or do you think they're moving less? What do you think? Both. Maybe so.
It's probably the quality of food too, right? More processed food versus growing your own food.
Yeah, these are all good hypotheses. Here's the data. So here are the Mexican Pimas in the open circles. Here's the U.S. Pimas in dark triangles. So here's their total energy expenditure. What does that mean? That's how many calories they eat per day. Mexican Pimas, where are the open circles? 4,000 calories, 3,000. They're eating a lot, but they don't gain weight. Why? Because they're highly physically active. So from this data, it looks like it's mostly physical activity is the environmental factor. Well, clearly food's important, and if you take Americans and you see what they eat and you relate it to weight gain, it's quality of the diet is what you said. And here's data that supports that kind of idea. This is from the Nurses' Health Study, so about 70,000 people that they followed for 16 years, and they looked at who gained weight. And the Health Professionals Study, that's men, and these two are women. And so they just related how much weight change with what you're eating. And I sort of said fat, protein, carbohydrate, but we don't eat fat, protein, carbohydrate, we eat foods. So this supports your idea that quality of the diet is important. Maybe it's potato chips, fries. What things are helpful? Nuts, whole grains, fruits. So this is where we get those kind of recommendations, is epidemiologic studies that correlate the kinds of diet that we have with weight gain. Here are the beverage. Those who are drinking sugar-sweetened beverages tend to gain more weight. So I think you're right. Physical activity, there's data that's important. There's data that diet quality and quantity are important. And if you put those together, this is again from Nurses' Health Studies 1 and 2, where they looked over time. What happened to people's physical activity? Remember our first patient, he was moderately active when he was 20. By the time he's 60, he's sitting in conferences like this. No. And less physically active because his work didn't allow that. So if you look at how people's physical activity changes over time and how the quality of their diet changes, those people whose diet quality declined over their life and their physical activity declined were at the highest risk for weight change. So it probably is both. I think your point was, which is it, physical activity or food? It's probably both, and probably genetics plays a role. So for some people, physical activity is probably very important. For other people, diet and specific components of the diet might be very important. Somebody had asked about what's happened since the turn of the century, and John Peters was talking about, well, maybe we're all farmers, or when did industrialization happen? And Tim Church has looked at this, I think, going back to 1960. So it doesn't go all the way back to the turn of the century, but just 1960. And what's happened to our work lives? And I think we have this perception that industrialization has changed our work lives. And what he shows here is that agricultural jobs, at least in 1960s, there weren't many farmers anyway. Only 10% of the population was involved in agriculture. But what's really happened between 1960 and 2010 is the number of service jobs have gone up. And manufacturing or goods producing jobs, here's manufacturing data, has declined really dramatically. And what he did is, here are some specific types of work that have changed. So leisure, hospitality, professional services, health, education, financial services. So these have all increased pretty dramatically over the last 50 years. And what he did was he used data from the federal government about what kind of work are people really doing, like physically what are they doing. For example, and you estimate the exercise intensity. So there's people whose job is moderate intensity. So again, Tim Church, the way he talks about this is, 1960, the men would go work at the Ford Motor Company and they'd be putting a fender on the car. So Dan, I don't think I could do this. Pick up the fender, put it in the car, and bolt it on. So I'm physically working hard. You go to a Ford plant now, there aren't humans doing that. There's a machine doing that. And so manufacturing jobs that required physical labor, not farming jobs, but manufacturing jobs, those have really declined because really industrialization and mechanization have taken those jobs and given them to machines, whereas light and sedentary jobs, the kind of things that you and I do with much of our day, have dramatically increased. So actually Tim Church feels like this change is enough to explain much of the weight gain that we've had. So again, I think there are people out there who will say it's mostly physical activity. Other people say it's all fructose. And I think Dr. Hill and Dr. Peters are going to talk a bit about this afternoon. Which is it, diet or physical activity? I think your answer that it's probably both. It's not just probably both. It's probably specific things for specific people. That's, again, I think where that genetics piece comes in. Are we gaining weight because of low metabolism? I just put this up there because this is a common question I get asked in clinic. I get probably one person in a clinic who comes in and says, I'm gaining weight and I'm not eating anything. And I have a metabolic problem. So is that true? My first figure would make you think it's not true. But this is an old-fashioned study to address this common question. And what they did is they took a group of people who said I'm not eating anything and I'm gaining weight. And they said, great, we're going to study your metabolism and see if that's indeed what you are. And so here they are. Group one are the people who said that they had low metabolism. And here's where they fall in line. There's energy expenditure versus lean body mass or fat-free mass. They're right on the line. So there was no evidence for that. And then they did something extra, which is they put them on a clinical research unit, and they measured everything that they ate, and they put them in a calorimeter and measured their energy expenditure. And they said to the person, we're going to figure this out. And here's what they found. So here's these people. There's 10 of these people. So each of these is a person. And here's their total energy expenditure. You're an expert in this now. What does total energy expenditure tell you? It tells you how much you get to eat, right? So if your weight is stable, that's how much you're eating. So there's their measured total energy expenditure in this person and this person, 2,000 to 3,000. Look at this person, patient number 9. His energy expenditure is 3,500 calories a day. And what they then did is they said, how much are you eating? So they're on there. They're looking at people put the food on the plate, and they eat, and they give the plate back. And so they know they're being measured, and they say, so tell us how much you ate. Because the person says, I'm eating nothing, and I'm gaining weight. That's the reported intake. And then the person in the kitchen weighs the food and counts calories and says what they ate. So here's patient number 9, burning 3,500 calories a day, eating 2,500 calories a day, says they're eating 600 calories a day in a research setting. Now, I show you this picture. I never say this to my patients. There's no point in going here. This is so discouraging for people. But I think, because the cynic would say, oh, they're just lying. I don't think they're lying. I think they are honestly saying, to the best of their ability, this is what I think I'm eating. This is, I think, the lesion. The lesion is their brain has no idea what they're eating. Their system, their biologic regulatory system just is not working very well.
Isn't the energy expenditure still more than what everybody except for number 7 is eating?
Yeah, so if I weigh 300 pounds and you say I should burn 3,000 calories a day, and tomorrow I do just eat a salad. So I could honestly say I'm just eating salad and I weigh 300 pounds. But obviously I can't do that every day. So what's happening is this is a brief period of time, and the person is eating less, and if they stayed there, they would lose weight.
Okay.
So again, I think the person who says I'm eating salad, I'm gaining weight, is they are eating salad sometimes, and sometimes they're not eating salad.
So there's been this movement to report calories, and now I believe there's a federal law that says certain food chains have to put the number of calories for each item on the menu. It makes it very difficult not to know how many calories are in things that you're ordering at Panera.
Oh, come on. You just go like this. You just go. Don't ask, don't tell. And actually, Jim will tell you, I think that people actually, it goes the other way. That people say, I want more calories per dollar.
The studies actually suggest that most people pay no attention. You'll ask them, they say, there were calories on the menu board?
Yeah. Or people actually literally do use that for value. They say, let's say it's $5, $5. I get 5,000 calories for my $5 here. I'm going for the big serving. I'm not trying to make fun of people, really. I'm sorry. I sound like I am, and I'm not. I have great empathy for these people. I think, again, this tells you that this regulatory system in these people, it just doesn't work very well. Just one more thing that I put in, again, this one does go back to the turn of the century and shows what's happened here to total carbohydrate consumption and whole grains. This is whole grain consumption. So I think John Peters' point that our food supply has changed over a long period of time. I forget who asked that question. But again, I think you're right. The things like high fructose corn syrup, that's a much more recent development. But things like whole grains have really changed over a longer period of time. And some people do this sort of thing. They'll say, if this is prevalence of diabetes and here's high fructose corn syrup, these things overlie, and so they must be related. But again, I think correlation is certainly not causation. It raises hypotheses, but it doesn't prove that there's a relationship. Well, so food. I'm talking about food, and food has changed. And why has food changed? Why are we drinking high fructose corn syrup? It's in almost everything we eat. Why is it there? I think John Peters said it really well. The food industry is not trying to kill us. It's trying to sell product. Jim Hill invited me to this meeting once, as he sometimes does. This is a long time ago. It was a group of food nutrition scientists from Pepsi and Coke and things like that. Big companies, and I was supposed to talk about obesity and insulin resistance. And I was younger then. I had dark hair. I had hair, and I remember thinking, I'm feisty. I'm like, I'm going to tell these people they're criminals. They're trying to kill us all. So I'm having lunch with these people, and I was so struck by it. They're just working stiff like you and me. They just want a job, And I remember somebody from Hershey says something like, I said, don't you feel bad about all that saturated fat you're giving people? And they're sort of like, we tried to change that. We tried to reduce the saturated fat. We tweaked it the littlest bit, and you people don't want it. You want the saturated fat. We just give you what you want. I said, I was sitting next to somebody from McDonald's or something. I said, I don't get this. I'm not a business person. But, how can you supersize something? How can you give more food for less money? And the guy said, oh, you really are dumb, aren't you? They said, we make money when you turn left or you turn right. It's McDonald's and Burger King, and we know how your brain works. You're looking more food for less money, right? I go left. If you go left, we win. They said, we're just giving you what you want. So anyway, why I'm talking about food and that food's related to weight, but why are we eating what we're eating? Because our brains seem to make us want it, and the food company is giving us what we want. I think that's the truth. Well, how does our brain do this? So let's talk about the brain for a minute here. Mark's going to tell you more about this. And I told you some of this, that the fat tissue makes leptin. Leptin interacts with the gas and brake neurons in here, and they act on downstream things to regulate food intake. But we've learned more than that. There are other things, like the stomach makes this hormone called ghrelin. We think of it sort of as a hunger hormone, because the higher it is, the more you eat, the lower it is, the less you eat. And there are other signals from the intestines. There's things like PYY and cholecystokinin. These are part of this complex regulatory system, so that the intestine, the stomach, adipose tissue, all these organs are talking to the brain, so the brain knows where fuel is. And so we learned a lot about the hypothalamus in this regulation of food intake, and everybody thought, okay, now we're going to find some drugs that are going to cure obesity. Have you heard any drugs in this stuff that cure obesity? Didn't work. So leptin, everybody thought leptin, that's going to be the cure for obesity. Turns out people are leptin resistant. You can't cure obesity with leptin. People have tried a number of these drugs, these melanocortin receptor agonists, things that relate to PYY. A lot of work going on with ghrelin. Maybe it's going to work, but so far, the biology we learned here did not fix obesity. So what's the problem? Is this irrelevant? Or is there some other reason why we're eating? And I think people started to say, well, maybe we don't eat because we're hungry. Maybe we eat because we like it. Somebody asked about social, cultural things. I think you said something about some cultures. What culture doesn't like food, right? What mom does not give her kid some food because they've been a good kid? Because food has rewarding properties. We all love to eat. And why do we do that? That has to do with the biology of reward. And so people started to say, well, what do we know about reward? Well, we've learned a lot about reward from drug addiction research. People said, why do people use drugs that ruin their life? Because they want to. And they she has personal experience there with a friend of hers. But somebody said, we didn't evolve these parts of our brain for cocaine. We evolved these things for other things that are rewarding. And so same pathways, they reasoned, would be involved with food intake. And so with the work, again, I won't go through all of this, but there are certain neurotransmitters, such as dopamine, acting in certain brain areas, such as the ventral striatum. The drug addiction research suggests that this is kind of where reward happens. And so people have thought about this and wondered, what's different about people who gain weight who don't? Do they have problems in this reward system? Maybe it isn't about the hypothalamus. Maybe it's about some other part of the brain that has to do with how food tastes and whether people like it or not. And then there's this interesting idea of liking versus wanting. Because again, the food intake and reward area has learned a lot from drug addiction. It's not exactly parallel, but I think the question is, are there some parallels that we can learn from? So people who use drugs, they often will say, yeah, when I first used cocaine, it was like the best thing that ever happened in my life. I loved it. And then 5 years later, you say, what do you think of that cocaine? They go, it's horrible. I hate this stuff. Why are you using it? Because I crave it. I want it. So there's something different, and this relates to something about addiction and a transition of how the reward system works. I'm not saying we understand this. I'm just sort of highlighting to you where the research has gone. Started with the hypothalamus because of leptin. Didn't find any cures. So the scientists say, let's look somewhere else. Maybe we're eating because we want it or like it, and so that's where the research is going. I'll just show you some pictures. This is this Nora Valco. This is an old paper, 1989. So when functional brain imaging or brain imaging became used, this is a PET scan. I can't believe they did this. So this is some guy, they like shoot him up with cocaine in the PET scanner. This is your brain on drugs. I love the way they say it. So this is the ventral striatum. So it's not the hypothalamus. You give somebody cocaine in their Christmas tree right there in the ventral striatum. So they go, oh, that's it. That is what cocaine is doing. It is working on these neurons in that brain region. And so then somebody said, well, does food do that? And I won't go through all the technological things. This is Ritalin occupies these sites. And so what's happening or competes with the internal dopamine. So here's a control condition where people are shown just a neutral stimuli, and here's the ventral striatum, looks the same. What they're trying to show you here is with a food-related stimuli, then you give Ritalin, which competes. It's not competing well because there's something sitting there. So this is an indirect measure of dopamine occupancy in the ventral striatum. So this is taken as evidence that this pleasure part of the brain is activated by food stimuli. Sorry. And again, I won't go through the data. The data is very complicated. Do people gain weight because they are more or less sensitive to food-related stimuli? And the data suggests actually that people who are obese are less sensitive to food stimuli. They have less responsiveness to the same dopamine in that brain region. So you might say maybe people gain weight because the regulatory system is less responsive to the pleasurable aspects of food, so they eat more to gain the same level of pleasure, as though it's being regulated as some level of pleasure. But we don't all act for pleasure, right? If we all act for pleasure, you probably would be here today. You'd be out doing cocaine or something, or eating food or something like that. So pleasure is counterbalanced with self-regulation. And so the neuroscientists have looked at where does self-regulation live. And so here's your brain, and there are things like dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. This is the part of your brain there on the side, and there's medial prefrontal cortex. And so what people have found is that these regions of the brain seem to be responsible for decision making and control. So that is, why are you thinking, maybe you're not thinking about my talk. Maybe you're thinking about the banana, I don't know. So people make decisions of what they're going to focus on. And that choice of what am I going to focus on lives in this part of your brain, it seems like. And so maybe the problem is food isn't more or less pleasurable to some people, but they just can't get the food stimulus out of their brain. And so, again, there's a lot of research here. I'm just covering the waterfront here. This is an area of research called impulsivity and self-control, and people have tried to study this. Again, we started with hypothalamus and hunger and fullness. We talked a bit about pleasure, but it's not just that. There's something about impulsivity here. And what people, again, we learned this from drug addiction research. Impulsivity, as manifest in the prefrontal cortex, is reduced in drug addicts. It's increased in drug addicts using strategies to resist drug cues. It's increased in reduced obese women. It's markedly increased in people with anorexia nervosa. What's anorexia nervosa? These people lose weight, and they self-report that food stimuli is not only pleasurable, but it's aversive. They don't want to see food stimuli. It's a negative thing. So what most of us would think is a positive stimulus, it's not in these people. And why? It seems like prefrontal cortex has some reason for that. And so how do you measure this? How do you measure this impulsivity? Because again, the only way we know anything scientifically is to do an experiment. And the experiment has to measure differences between groups. And there's this delayed discounting tool that's kind of a clue toward this impulsivity. Have you guys heard about this one? Oh, this is a wild tool. The guy who invented this was a drug addiction researcher. And he was a postdoc, and he's working at this rehab facility. And he has this patient who is, been there for like 4 months and hasn't used any drugs for 4 months. He's getting ready to get out of there, and this guy, postdoc's really happy that the guy's succeeding. And so he goes out on pass. The patient goes out on pass for a week. He comes back in, and he's high as a kite. And so this guy talks to him. He says, "Oh, what are you doing? What are you doing? You were doing so good." And the patient, the guy, drug addict, says, "Well, I heard from my friends that there was some stuff on the street and that people were dying. And I had to get some of it." What does that mean? And so the guy says, "What is going on in that brain? There was stuff on the street and people are dying, and I would need to get some of that." And so what he's thinking is, to this guy, the reward of that drug is so powerful that it's worth dying for. And so how do each of us make decisions? Maybe you've seen the old marshmallow. Have you seen the marshmallow study from the 50s? Yeah, a few of you said yes. They put a little kid in a room with a bowl of marshmallows, and they say, if you don't eat the marshmallows, I'm leaving you with the marshmallows, and if I come back, I'll give you a candy bar or something. So they close the door, and some of the kids are like, one girl goes like this, stands in the corner and is like, another kid's like facing the wall and counting 1, 2, 3. So what are they trying to do? There's reward and there's prefrontal cortex. There's inhibition of that impulse. The drug addicts is saying the reward is so high, there is no inhibition at all. I could die for this drug. So that's impulsivity. It's how you weigh short-term gains with long-term consequences. It's fundamental. Why did you guys come here today instead of your home with your family? Short-term gains are whatever. Long-term, we're doing this all the time. We're measuring what we're doing right now compared to what the long-term implications are. So this is the delayed discounting task. What they do is you ask somebody, I could say, I'll give you $100 now or $100 in a month. What'll you take? Take the $100 now. So I say, I'll give you $100 in a month, or I'll give you $90 now. question is, are you willing to wait a month for the extra $10? So I'll give you $1,000 in a month or $999 today. I'll take the $999 today, right? I'm not going to wait that long for a month for $1. But I'll give you $1,000 and then I'll give you $500 today. I'll wait the month, right? So you can do this with people, and you can vary the amount of the money, and you can vary the delay, and you draw a curve. And so this is an objective measure of this impulsivity quality. And so here's an example of control women and obese women, and there's the delay discounting curve. So the obese women aren't willing to wait as long for the money. So this is taken to mean, again, you can believe the study or not, but this is taken to be a test of this prefrontal activity and this impulsivity idea. So why are we getting heavy? Is it because our hypothalamus is broken? It is in leptin deficient people. Is it because we have a difference in pleasure sensation, or does it have something to do with impulsivity and the biology associated with prefrontal cortex?
Dan, can
yeah.
I just ask you on the previous slide, the delayed discounting, I presume that they accounted for all the other factors that might be related to, to your willingness to wait for money.
Socioeconomic status, employability, education, stuff like that. Yes. So the groups are matched for that. Yeah. Good.
So it really is just about not wanting to wait.
Well, again,
Not being,
isn't it sometimes it's not, it goes past that to the not being able to, when that ability surpasses the want.
She says not being able to wait, and again, I think it gets to the biologic function of this part of the brain. Can you wait? It's the kid who, the marshmallows are there, they close the door, and the kid basically starts eating the marshmallows. He doesn't have the capacity to do it. The other kids are trying to use cognitive strategies for counteracting the impulsivity. And here's just one other idea. Again, you probably have heard of this study. It's an older study now. This is a social network study. This uses the Framingham Heart cohort because they had data over 30 years and 12,000 individuals. And what they did was they knew about relationships between people. And they looked at weight change over this long study as a function of social contacts. And what they found was that a person's chance of becoming obese increased if they had a friend who became obese over that interval. So here's a picture of the thing. If you looked at this online, there's a great video of this animated, because I can't show you every couple of year studies, but each of these circles is a person, and this person only has one friend, I guess. Whereas some of these people have got a bunch of friends. So if there's a line between these two people, they have a relationship. So what you can see is some of these people have a lot of relationships between them. If it's a yellow circle that's big, that means you're heavy. If it's a small green circle, that means you're light. And so what they showed, here's 1975, 1990, 2000. And what you can see is there's a lot more yellow circles here than they were back here. So the average person gained weight over this time. But if you look at oops, I thought I had circles there. But if you look at groups of people, the heavy people tend to cluster together and the light people tend to cluster together. And what they showed statistically, and you can see it if you watch the video, it's wild to watch these relationships change between people over 30 years and stuff. But what you can see is that over time that people became heavy together. And so what did we talk about? We started with hypothalamus, we did reward, we did impulsivity, but there's also social aspects. I think your comment about the social meaning of food, I think, is relevant here. So this is how I think about how the brain regulates weight. There are these homeostatic factors, things we talked about like leptin and glucose and the hormones that come from the GI tract. But there's also these non-homeostatic factors, things like hedonics and dopamine. This probably lives in the hypothalamus. This probably lives in the ventral striatum. But then there's also these aspects of self-control, decision-making, emotional factors, which really interact here with the pleasure aspects of food and are independent of these homeostatic factors, or can be. And then there are these social cognitive factors, things like the meaning of food, ideas of diet and health. Most of us have strong ideas about, should we be physically active? Is that a good thing to do or not? How important is it? Where did those ideas come from? And these things interact. If you are in negative energy balance, if I don't eat anything for a day and now you show me food, the rewarding properties of the food increase. So that's probably how the homeostatic factors work, is by changing rewarding properties of the food. And obviously, there's interactions between reward and things like social cognitive. Why do parents use food as a reward? Because it's an intrinsically rewarding substance. And so these things interact with each other. These social cognitive factors then interact with our self-control. If we believe that we should not be eating as much, then that idea, which came from the environment, interacts with the hardware we have that allows us to either be more or less impulsive. And much of this exists in the unconscious parts of our brain. So a lot of this is not actually accessible to voluntary choice, which makes it, I think, really challenging to deal with. Well, I'm just going to do a couple of things here. Again, we'll see how much time, or you guys get bored. I'm just going to throw out a couple other topics that you hear about in the media, things like that you guys may be exposed to, and I'll just give you a little background on what is that. Those are the bacteria that live in our intestine. So as you probably know, we have more cells and more DNA that comes from bacteria in our bodies and on our bodies than of ourselves. So we're really, humans are made up not just of our own biology, but of our microbiome. And so there's emerging data on the role of the microbiome in weight regulation. The initial studies were done in these germ-free mice. So there was a guy who was interested in how bacteria interact with the immune system of the GI tract. He was a basic gastroenterologic immune person. So he got these mice and raised them in such a way that they were completely free of any bacteria. And what he found was that when they're born, they were thin. And then once they colonized with bacteria, they gained weight. So that was the first observation that made people say, oh my gosh, maybe the bacteria in our intestines are helping to regulate our weight. And it sort of makes sense because the intestine provides a lot of information to the brain about what you ate, and it's where nutrients are absorbed. So the idea that bacteria in your intestine could do this seems biologically plausible. And so the research, what's happened, has really focused on characterizing the differences in the microbiome between lean, obese, and reduced people. So the first thing was bugs are important. Let's just describe how they're different between different groups of people. But you might guess there are some problems there. You would like to see people before they got obese. Because the question is, are the bacteria different because they're obese, or did it cause the obesity? And those are challenging studies to do that we don't have good data on yet. But more recently, people have taken more of a functional therapeutic approach and said, well, if we know what the microbiome is associated with thinness, maybe let's use that. Let's try to change the microbiome and see if it changes the phenotype. So this is the kind of work that gets done in this area. And I'll just show you an example of this. I really like this paper. This is a guy who used to be in our infectious disease division here. He's in New York now. And what he thought was, he's an infectious disease doctor. So how can you change the microbiome? You can stick bacteria in there. Some people are trying to do those things. Or you can give antibiotics. So he said, we're doing this anyway. In agriculture, antibiotics has been shown to increase animal weight and growth. I mean, a lot of people say, I want my food natural. I don't want antibiotic-treated meat. Well, why do they use antibiotics anyway? Because it makes the animals grow better. So that implies, here's an antibiotic that changes weight. And so he thought, maybe we do that in people, right? So the average American child receives 1 course of antibiotic per year during childhood. So what we're doing in animals, we're doing to our children. And so he thought maybe the weight gain that we're seeing is partly related to the use of antibiotics, was the general idea. So what he did is he exposed mice to subtherapeutic doses of antibiotics and then looked at their body fat and looked at their gut microbiome and a bunch of metabolic genes in their liver to try to understand the relationship between these things. And again, there's kind of a lot of stuff here. This is the weight of the mice over here in the control, and they're pretty much superimposable. But he used a tool so he could look at their body fat. And so here's measures of their fat mass. And the blue bar is the control animals, and then these are penicillin, vancomycin, penicillin plus vancomycin. So a range of antibiotics, all at subtherapeutic doses. And this is an average. So what you can see is the fat mass in these mice. There's control. There's the ones that got antibiotics. And this is that's fat mass. This is percent body fat, controls, and the ones that got antibiotics. And that's because the lean body mass went down. So what he showed was exposing mice, same mice, genetically the same environment, only difference is these get antibiotics and these don't. And the antibiotics result in more fat mass and less lean body mass. And the reason for it was, oh my God, it's a bunch of genes. So again, what he did is that these are changes in genes in the liver. And look at all these different genes in the liver, and these are subtherapeutic antibiotic treated groups. So just giving the antibiotics changed the microbiome, and that changed a lot of information in the liver. So again, I'm not saying we shouldn't give our kids antibiotics. I'm just trying to give you a sense of where this field is going. And I think it's something you're going to be hearing about over coming years, is microbiome and how it relates to body weight regulation. Here's another general topic area, circadian rhythms and weight. And again, I think there's epidemiologic data that shows that shortened sleep time is associated with diabetes, obesity, metabolic syndrome. And there's also data that shows shortened sleep time is associated with increased food intake, and there are changes in those homeostatic hormones. So if you take people and you let them sleep a bunch, and then in another time you shorten their sleep and you just let them eat what they want to, if they're not sleeping, they're eating. Have any of you done that? What's not clear is whether changing sleep is useful as a therapeutic tool. It would make sense that maybe it would be, and I certainly in clinic, I talk to my patients about their sleep, but it's not entirely clear if that helps or not. And how does this work? Why should sleep affect this? And again, I think we're really starting to learn a lot about what sleep does. I mean, what an interesting thing sleep is. You know, if you're an animal and all of a sudden you just lay down and you get unconscious for 8 hours, you'd think that would be a bad thing, wouldn't you? Like, wouldn't we get eaten if we're just laying there unconscious? And yet all species, they do this thing where the body shuts off for a while. What is going on there? And again, the neuroscientists have focused on things like memory and learning and stuff like that. I think we've thought less about what goes on metabolically. Because if you think about that as well, here we're eating and all of a sudden we just stop eating for 8 hours. If I told you right now, sorry, you can't eat for 8 hours, you wouldn't be happy. But every day we do it, we stop eating for 8 hours. So it seems like the body, there's something very important in these circadian rhythms. So here's some data that relates to this. This is, again, Nurses' Health Study. So 68,000 women followed for 16 years, divided into those who remember our patient at the beginning only slept 5 or 6 hours a night? Mm-hmm. So here are the women who sleep less and 7 or 8 hours. So their 7 or 8 hours looks ideal. And then if you sleep only 5 hours, you weigh more. So at every year, the women who slept less weighed more. And if you slept less, your rate of weight gain was higher. So again, a lot of confounders here. What are the genetics? What's the diet? Things like that. But this is the kind of data that made people think, yes, sleep duration is important in weight gain. Well, what does sleep deprivation do? And again, I won't go through all this. There's data on each of these points. If you experimentally sleep deprive people, they self-report more hunger, their leptin levels are lower, and their ghrelin levels, that's the hunger hormone, are higher. They have an increased opportunity to eat. What are you going to do at 11 o'clock if you're not sleeping? The refrigerator's looking pretty good, so maybe you'll eat more just because you're not sleeping. It's something else to do. There are changes in energy expenditure, thermal regulation, and it could be that you're more fatigued, and so you move less because you're more tired. And again, there's some data about physical activity levels in people who are sleep deprived. So more food, less energy expenditure results in obesity. So again, you could talk a lot about this. This is just to highlight an area of emerging science that relates to body weight regulation. Oh, and this is interesting. I'll just share this. There are these things called clock genes. How does your body know what time it is? And there's these amazing biologic systems that regulate this. It's really an internal clock. I don't know, some of you maybe wake up at the same time every morning, or you get tired at the same time every day. How does that happen? How does your body know what time it is? You know, before we had clocks, the body has its internal clock, and these clock genes that set the clock in all tissues. What they did here was they just messed up the clock gene just in fat cells. They didn't mess up the whole body's clock. They just messed up the clock in fat cells, and these are the animals that's fat mass, body weight and fat mass in the animals where they messed up the clock gene. So I think what it shows is, and I won't go through all the biology of this, the fact that shortened sleep time is associated with weight gain highlighted how important not just the brain and hypothalamus, but how the circadian rhythms and the timings of meals relates to body weight regulation. What am I going to do? I'm going to spend just the last couple of minutes talking about adaptive responses to weight loss. Do I got time to do this? Should I keep going for a few more minutes?
You have until 11:45. I just want to make sure if anybody has questions.
Because you're getting tired. I'm talking too much.
I want to make sure people have an opportunity for questions.
Great. Should I stop now and answer questions? I could leave this part.
Why don't we see what we have now? I know Barbara has a question.
I have a question. The thyroid is such a misunderstood yet vital part of the regulatory system. And I was surprised that you didn't cover that in your presentation. Given that thyroid disease is really becoming an epidemic and so many people are actually walking around undiagnosed, and of course there's a very direct link to being overweight or obese if your thyroid is not optimized. Can you talk a little bit about that, about maybe the link that thyroid hormones have with some of the other hormones you mentioned?
Yeah, so I'm an endocrinologist, and I study weight, so I see a lot of people who feel like their weight must be related to their thyroid. And again, the thing about thyroid hormone is that it acts through a nuclear receptor. So that what that means is the hormone goes into a cell. It actually turns into a T4 turns into T3, so it's modified inside the cell, and it acts inside the cell, and it acts differently in different cells. So I think our understanding, our ability to measure what a normal hormone level is, has some limitations. But having said that, we have better blood tests to measure thyroid hormone than we do many other hormones. And if you just take a group of unselected obese individuals, the prevalence of low thyroid hormone is not that different than the general population. So you're right. If somebody has low thyroid hormone, they tend to gain weight. If somebody has high thyroid hormone from a disease state, they tend to lose weight. But most of my patients who are obese, their thyroid hormone levels are normal. Now, and as a clinical person, all I can do is give them more hormone or not. And if we give somebody too much hormone, then there are risks associated with that. So in general, garden variety obesity doesn't appear to be largely related to too much thyroid hormone. Now, when somebody loses weight, thyroid hormone levels fall and energy expenditure falls. So the role of thyroid hormone in promoting weight regain after somebody loses weight, I think, is an area that people are trying to investigate more. So you're right, thyroid hormone helps regulate body weight. And so is that why most people gain weight? And the answer is, based on their blood tests, we don't think so. And therapeutically, using thyroid hormone to help regulate weight probably does more harm than good. Does that sort of answer the question some?
In a very lay person follow-up to that, for many, many years, a lot of obese people would say, I have a glandular problem.
Yeah.
Is that what they were referring to, or just, it just, they weren't able to lose weight and they grabbed onto this vague term? And
I think it's sort of the latter. I mean, it's incredibly frustrating to gain weight if you feel like your behavior is the same as it has been. Remember what I said, though, as we get older, you can't even eat the same. You got to eat less or you're going to gain weight. And so I think gaining weight with time is incredibly frustrating for people, and I think people around them, I think, maybe we tend to be biased against heavy people. We tend to blame them for their behavior, and yet they don't feel the response. They're not choosing to do this. They don't want to gain weight. And so I think most of them feel like there's something biological going on here. And since they may not know about this whole regulatory system, and because they've heard of people who are hypothyroid gaining weight and that sort of thing, I think people do latch onto this idea that it's a glandular or hormonal problem.
The AMA, I believe, not that long ago, came out and said that obesity was a disease.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious about what you think about that.
Yeah. So Jim and I'll let you answer this one too, because I think he and I are a little bit on different pages on this one. Well, actually, I'll let you start. Why do you think it's a disease?
Well, we talked a little bit last night. I could argue vehemently either way. I come down on the selfish side. Selfishly, I believe that calling it a disease will lead to reimbursement, which will allow us to take programs that are effective but not the cheapest out there, and actually be able to deliver better weight management to people. Second point is, the way it stands right now, it's not a disease. That's not working very well for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the fact, or obese people have more diabetes, more heart disease, more hypertension, more strokes, more cancer than people who are lean. So obesity is clearly a marker for things that are going to hurt people. They have more degenerative arthritis, more depression. So that would make you think it's a disease. The challenges I have with it first is and I think nobody chooses to be obese. Nobody says, oh, please, I really want to weigh 300 pounds. So I think it is a reflection of a biologic system that's not working well. Some of the challenges in calling it a disease are, we're kind of giving mixed message. On the one hand, we're saying you have no control over your weight because it's biologically determined. Well, if that's the case, well, then you ought to just give up because you can't fix this. And that's clearly not right. Some people are able to lose weight and keep it off for a period of time. So it's not absolutely biologically determined. The other thing is weight itself. There's data that as you get older, being overweight is not that harmful. And in fact, if you have some disease states, maybe being overweight, it doesn't hurt you. So where else do we have a disease where the presence of the disease is associated with longer lifespan or no risk? So I think obesity seems to be partly an intermediary between our lifestyle and these things that kill us, like heart attacks and strokes. Very few people die of being obese. They die of sleep apnea or heart disease, and so the obesity predisposes to that. So in some ways it's a semantic difference. But I think it gets to this idea you guys are talking about. People have this subjective experience that I don't want to be heavy, I'm not choosing to be this way, I'm doing everything I can, and it's not working. So it must be biologic. And yes, there's a lot of biology here. So it's kind of how do you talk about that that's challenging.
Can we do this? Can I ask a favor? Can you get through this last, because now we're on the edge of our seat, what happened to AJ?
Oh, you are?
Is it possible for you to do that, and then we will release those people who want to go out and get lunch, and if other people have questions, maybe you have an extra 5 minutes.
Oh yeah, I'm happy to hang out as long. So there he is. So he does it. It sort of relates to what we're talking about. So yay, he succeeds. Oh gosh. He moves to different work 6 hours a week, and now I'm so sad for him. Oh my gosh. So this is the story I hear all the time. And it speaks to this issue we're talking about here, is there is biology here, and people can fight this, but when they fight it, often they, why is it hard for people to maintain the reduced state? And again, I think body weight is regulated in a manner that when you lose weight, energy expenditure declines. So people think, I'll do this for a while and now I'll be fixed. Well, the answer is it's a regulatory system, and it's your regulatory system for life, and it's going to fight you. So when you lose weight, energy expenditure declines, metabolism changes in a way that promotes weight regain, your appetite increases. And so people need to understand that losing weight can be done, but that it's not like a bladder infection, that it just goes away. This is a lifelong thing, and that in fact the body is pushing back. The body is trying to regain weight. And you can counteract these with some things like exercise and environmental changes. I'm just going to, Paul McLean's done this. So here's our rat who gains weight their whole life, and you can put on a diet and it regains, again, not to where it was, but to where it would have been. That's the model. And you can do that in humans as well. So you can take a human and make them gain weight or lose weight. This is what Rudy Leibel and them did a long time ago. And they measured energy expenditure. Now you're experts in energy expenditure, right? What is this? This is how much you get to eat. So there's the line. So here are people who, the open figure is their initial weight. Here's 10% weight gain. Here's 10% weight loss. So people are right on the line, but then when they gain weight, what happens? They come off the line. For the same weight, they burn more energy. So remember with that first rat study, you overfeed them. What do they want to do? They want to lose weight. And so that's the biology. They overfeed, their energy expenditure goes up. They lose weight, look, they're coming off the line. These people are lower on the line. And what is it? This is resting energy expenditure and total energy expenditure. So they're off the line. So what's happening is when people lose weight, they become more energy efficient. So that's what's so frustrating. To not only do they have to reduce their food intake, they got to keep it low for the rest of their life. And why does it happen? Again, there's a lot of reasons, but the thyroid hormone is some of that. Other things like the sympathetic nervous system. So when people lose weight, energy expenditure goes down, that fights them. That's why our patient regained weight partly is his energy expenditure goes down. It goes down, here's a figure that Jim and Holly, I think, use. Here's energy expenditure before weight loss and after weight loss. Look at that. There's a decline there of 350 calories per day, and if they don't adhere to that 350 calories, then they're going to regain the weight again. And what happens to appetite? This is a study where they took people, and here are the people, and they lost this weight, and they kept it off for about a year. And what happened to their hunger levels? This is hunger after a meal. So there's a meal, 30 minutes after a meal, 60. So they're hungry before the meal. This is a baseline. And they eat a meal and the hunger goes down. But after they lose weight, they're more hungry all the time. So that's the body saying, I don't like it here. Body weight is regulated. It wants to be in a different place. So energy expenditure is going down, hunger is going up, and it relates to these hormones. There's ghrelin, the kind of hunger hormone. There's a baseline. Again, feed a meal here, and the hormone goes down after the meal. But week 10 after weight loss or doesn't matter. A year later, the hunger hormone's higher, the fullness hormones are lower. So the body's fighting you. And again, this I think just highlights that this is a regulated system that people have to deal with long term. What happens if you keep your weight down long enough? Can you reset your set point? This Paul McLean asked this question. There are rats. Rats gain in weight. Put the rat on a diet for short time, longer time, lifetime for a rat. What do you think is going to happen? The longer it goes down, does it get used to it? What do you think? Oh, it's so depressing. Again, it doesn't go back to where it was. It goes back to where it would have been. It retains a biologic memory of a trajectory. That's how the system regulates. And in fact, the longer you wait, the faster it goes up because the farther it is away from where it wants to be. So that's the biology. Isn't that depressing? But Brett's going to tell you how to fix that with research, with the exercise. So in summary then, weight is regulated by a system with many parts. Weight tends to increase as we get older for most of us. It responds to weight loss with adaptive responses that promote weight regain. And yet, despite that, there are people who lose weight and keep it off. And Jim has worked hard with this National Weight Control Registry to so this isn't impossible. People can do this differently. So weight maintenance really is possible. And Holly's going to talk to you about this too, because humans are not rats. The rats show us the biology, but what do humans have? They have that cognitive function. They have that social meaning and values. They have that self-regulation piece. So that's why humans can do this, is because they have the biology to do that. Great. Questions?
Thank you so much.
Sure.
One other hypothesis that you didn't mention that's been getting a little bit more attention lately is the presence of endocrine disruptors in the environment, like shampoos and plastics and things like that, and how do you think that has an impact on obesity?
Yeah, and there's another kind of corollary to that is toxins. There's this idea that there are toxins in the environment and people grow more fat mass to sequester fat-soluble toxins. So I think these are emerging ideas, and they are hypotheses to be tested. I think the endocrine disrupting chemicals, these are things that are in commercial products that look like hormones and signal as hormones do. I think we just don't know enough about those. And again, you can start with animal studies and then epidemiologic studies. And how do you translate that in with the complex genetics and other factors? I think it's going to be hard to sort that out. Yeah.
Every time I go to Europe, I see people having dinner at 10 o'clock at night, drinking alcohol at every meal, eating full-fat meals, pasta, cream, sugar, salt, and yet you don't see anyone obese walking around. Why do you think that is?
Jim, what do you think of that? You have an answer for that.
First of all, I think obesity rates are increasing in Europe. They're lower than in the U.S. I think there are a couple of things that I would point to. I would point to the fact they still walk more to get around for transportation and so forth. And the other thing is I do think portion sizes are a little smaller, even though they're eating really good stuff. I oftentimes look at the sizes I get in Europe and I say, boy, people back home would be really upset about portions this size. So those are two things that might make a difference.
Yeah, great. Other questions? Yes.
Is anyone looking into epigenetics and obesity?
Oh.
Just the idea that the genes might be changing in childhood, passing.
Yeah, whole great area. I mean, I think there's a whole body of work about the prenatal environment and how the prenatal environment shapes later life. and how epigenetics relate to that. But epigenetics probably occurred during lifetime as well. So we're talking not just about the gene sequence, but how the genes are modified by a variety of chemical means. And could foods or hormones do that? So yeah, a lot of work, mostly starting with that prenatal environment, where there's really compelling evidence that programming that occurs, same genetics, but stuff that happens in utero affects the later weight trajectory. Yeah, good point. Yeah, other questions? Yes.
I have a question. I think I heard on NPR, this is about epigenetics, but that there is a hormone that, and it might be for babies, that if the mother has a specific hormone and it's passed to the baby that might contribute to obesity, it means that obesity could be contagious. Have you heard?
Yeah, so there's a lot of words there that maybe I can't comment. One is hormones, and some hormones cross the placenta and some don't. A lot of what happens between the mother and the baby is nutrition. And so the mom eats, and then she gives nutrition, whether that's glucose or fat, to the baby. And then the baby deals with that nutrition in the same way as the mom does, but with their own hormones. So I'm not sure about the specific hormone you're talking about. What we used to think, and where did this evidence come from? It comes from both under and over nutrition. There was this, when people, mothers have pregnancies occur and there's a famine going on, then same genetics, but the babies born to a mother who's malnourished during pregnancy are more likely to be obese when they grow up. But conversely, overnutrition is the same way. Mothers who are obese, their children are more likely to become obese later based on the environment, the nutritional environment that the baby's in. We used to think that it was glucose, that glucose crossed the placenta, and that when it did, babies' insulin levels would be higher, and that insulin stimulated the growth of the baby. And we know that from gestational diabetes and diabetic moms, their babies tend to be bigger. But I think more recently it's become clear that actually it's maybe triglycerides and fat that increases fat deposition in the baby. And once the baby has more fat mass at birth, maybe that's perpetuated through life. So I didn't completely answer the question, but yeah.
Okay, I'm going to let everybody know that lunch is outside. We will hear from Holly at 12:30, so you've got 37 minutes to have your lunch, take a walk, do whatever you need to do. The wireless in the room is working now, so you can follow instructions on the board and hook up to wireless if you haven't. And I think Dr. Bessesen might be around for a couple minutes for individual questions at this point. So thank you so much.
Yeah,